Sup, goddammit. Now, you don't say that to an actor. You couldn't say that to Joe Montana in the Super Bowl. I mean, and this.
For more than 60 years, Hollywood saw Robert Duvall as calm, disciplined, and unshakable. But at 94 years old, the legendary actor finally broke his silence. And what he revealed shocked the entire industry. He named names. 6 of them. Not strangers, but idols, brothers, mentors, and every one of them a Hollywood giant. These are the actors Robert Duvall secretly despised, and the explosive stories behind the hatred. 1. There was a time when Robert Duvall and Al Pacino weren't just co-stars. They were brothers in every sense that mattered. Long before fame hardened their edges, they shared a tiny apartment in Beverly Glen, splitting cheap cans of noodles, borrowing each other's jackets, arguing about scripts late into the night. They dreamed together, failed together, got back up together. There was no rivalry, no ego, just 2 hungry young actors chasing a future they could barely afford to imagine. But that kind of purity doesn't survive Hollywood for long. Not when money, power, and legacy come into the room. By the time the Godfather trilogy reached its final chapter, something had shifted. Slowly at first, then painfully, unmistakably. When Paramount sent out contract for Part 3, the numbers told a story neither man wanted to speak out loud. Pacino was offered $5 million plus a percentage of profits. Duvall was offered $1 million flat. Not even close, not even respectful. It wasn't the money that broke Duvall. It was the message buried beneath it. One man mattered more. One man was the face. The other was the background. He folded the contract slowly, as if he were burying something sacred. Then he stood up, walked out of the room, and didn't raise his voice, didn't slam a door. Hours later, a single fax reached Francis Ford Coppola's desk. One sentence, handwritten like a quiet dagger. I won't return just to be someone's backdrop. And just like that, 20 years of brotherhood cracked down the middle. Hollywood tried to pretend it was a scheduling issue. Agents tried to negotiate a compromise. Francis tried to fix what was already dead. But Duvall refused to return unless the studio treated them like equals. Pacino refused to cut his salary to close the gap. Duvall took that as the final betrayal. You can't preach family on screen and forget it off screen, he told a reporter years later. Not with bitterness, just a tired ache in his voice. So Duvall retreated to his quiet farm in Virginia, looking for roles that felt honest, roles far away from Hollywood politics. Pacino stayed in the storm, growing louder, wilder, more unpredictable, becoming the symbol of ambition, while Duvall became the symbol of integrity. When The Godfather Part 3 finally premiered without him, critics felt the absence instantly. They wrote that the film had lost its conscience, lost the quiet moral anchor Tom Hagen, once brought to the Corleone family. And the saddest part? They never repaired what broke. At the 2011 Oscars, the cast reunited on stage. The camera zoomed in on the legends standing shoulder to shoulder. But if you looked closely, you saw the truth. 2 men who used to share dreams couldn't even share eye contact. Their faces stayed blank, their bodies still, their eyes fixed on anything but each other. 2 brothers, now strangers, standing inches apart yet separated by a silence that had lasted decades. 2. When Robert Duvall first crossed paths with Francis Ford Coppola, he didn't just meet a director. He met the man who would shape the meaning of his entire craft. Coppola looked at him once in a crowded casting room in 1971, pointed without hesitation, and said, "He's the Tom Hagen I've been looking for." That single sentence didn't just give Duvall a role. It gave him a place in cinematic history. It gave him a voice. It gave him family. For years after that, Duvall carried a kind of reverence for Coppola. He studied his notes the way a student studies scripture. Every camera move, every whispered direction, every shade of meaning in Coppola's voice. Duvall absorbed all of it like someone being taught not just how to act, but how to exist inside a story. Coppola became a teacher, a mentor, even a quiet compass in the chaos of Hollywood. But the man who once lifted him up would eventually become the one who dropped him hardest. The first fracture came far away from the warmth of New York and the dim-lit rooms of The Godfather. It came in the suffocating jungle heat of Apocalypse Now. During the napalm sequence, the sun was scorching, the smoke thick enough to choke on. Duvall pushed through, as he always did. But then he collapsed, not dramatically, not theatrically, but in the quiet way exhaustion sometimes takes a man. His mouth was dry, his lips cracked from the heat. He was depleted. Coppola looked at him, and instead of concern, he gave a simple order. Do it again. The light isn't right. Those words cut deeper than any physical strain. Duvall obeyed because he was professional, because he respected the man calling the shots. But something inside him changed. He didn't say it then, but he felt it. The line between dedication and cruelty had been crossed. He threw up blood between takes, wiped his mouth, and delivered his performance anyway. That scene would become iconic. The film would win the Palme d'Or. But Duvall's admiration for Coppola would never return to the shape it once had. Years later, the final blow came not with heat or helicopters, but with a contract, a single piece of paper placed on a boardroom table for The Godfather Part 3. When Duvall read his offered salary, he felt something deep inside him go cold. $1 million. A tiny fraction of what they offered Pacino. A fraction of the respect he believed the character, and he deserved. He folded the papers with a calmness that hid the sting. I won't act in a film about family, he said, if that family doesn't respect each other. No shouting, no scene, no dramatic exit. Just a man quietly walking away from the role that defined him. Coppola tried to apologize. He sent long handwritten letters, the kind meant to mend old wounds. He reached out through friends, through agents, through anyone who might soften Duvall's stance. But the silence that came back was absolute. The man who once felt like a father figure had become a stranger. The teacher had become the wound. And the bond that once shaped both of their careers dissolved into something small and distant, a memory neither of them could ever return to. Duvall never spoke of Coppola with anger, only with a quiet, lasting disappointment. And sometimes, disappointment is the sharpest form of hate. 3. Marlon Brando, the idol who became the enemy. When Robert Duvall first heard he would stand beside Marlon Brando on the set of The Godfather, he felt like a young soldier finally meeting the general who shaped his entire idea of the craft. He had studied Brando's performances the way monks study scripture. On the waterfront, A Streetcar Named Desire, The Wild One, Duvall studied every pause, every silence, every breath, believing he was learning from the greatest actor to ever live. Then the legend stepped onto the set for the first time. 2 hours late, sunglasses on, cigarette burning low between his fingers, 3 assistants orbiting him like planets around a sun that didn't care if it burned them. And in that moment, something cracked. The love didn't vanish, but the illusion did. Brando refused rehearsals. He hated preparation. He demanded cue cards be taped everywhere, behind lamps, on the walls, even on people's backs. Lines he didn't feel like learning were tossed aside like scraps. And every time he rewrote dialogue without warning, actors around him struggled to keep up. Duvall watched the chaos unfold with the quiet disappointment of a man realizing his hero was not disciplined, not precise, not even particularly respectful. He was the soul of the film, Duvall later admitted, and the enemy of every actor inside it. It was a confession soaked in admiration and resentment at the same time. The breaking point came when Paramount handed Brando a $50,000 bonus behind closed doors. Duvall didn't argue. He didn't complain. He simply stood up, walked out of the press room, and never forgot that feeling of being treated as less valuable, less essential, less seen. But the moment that truly killed the admiration happened at the 1973 Oscars. When Brando refused his Best Actor trophy and sent an activist in his place, half of America applauded. To Duvall, it wasn't brave. It was betrayal. He turned our work into a protest, he told a friend afterward. It wasn't that Duvall disagreed with the cause. He disagreed with turning his craft into a spectacle. The years hardened that feeling. Respect survived, but affection did not. Duvall stopped defending Brando. He stopped romanticizing him. He stopped pretending brilliance excused cruelty. And when Brando died in 2004, Robert Duvall did not go to the funeral. He sent a small white card to Coppola with just 3 words: "Let it end." That was his final goodbye to the man who taught him what greatness looked like and what it cost. For Robert Duvall never raised his voice when he talked about Stanley Kubrick. He didn't need to. The temperature in the room changed on its own. People who worked with him for decades had seen him angry, seen him disappointed, seen him betrayed. But nothing made him colder, nothing, than the name Stanley Kubrick. His resentment wasn't born from a personal attack or an on-set meltdown. It came from something deeper, something that shook Duvall's entire belief about what acting is supposed to be. To him, Kubrick represented a kind of brilliance that forgot the human cost of brilliance. A genius so obsessed with perfection that he forgot there were living, breathing people standing in front of the camera. At a Hollywood Reporter roundtable in 2010, Duvall stunned the whole panel when he said, almost casually, "To me, the great Stanley Kubrick was an actor's enemy." The room froze. It wasn't an insult delivered with heat. It was delivered with certainty. The kind of certainty that comes from watching someone strip the soul off a performance in the name of craft. His anger grew sharper after watching footage from The Shining. He saw Shelley Duvall, no relation to him, swinging that baseball bat again and again. 127 takes. Eyes swollen from crying, hands shaking, voice trembling, while Kubrick sat in the shadows pushing her further, demanding more fear, more exhaustion, more breakdown. Duvall winced watching it. It didn't look like directing to him. It looked like destruction. He remembered once meeting Kubrick for a potential role in the Aryan Papers. Sitting across from him in a cold room in London, listening to the director speak for 30 straight minutes about lenses, frame ratios, lighting grids, and camera rhythms. Not once did Kubrick mention emotion. Not once did he ask how Duvall envisioned the character. Not once did he look at an actor as a collaborator. Duvall later said the air in that room felt colder than a morgue, as if he was speaking to scientists who didn't believe in heartbeats. What bothered him wasn't that Kubrick was exacting. It was that Kubrick didn't seem to care if the actor disappeared under the weight of the process. Duvall believed acting came from instinct, from breath, from the moment the character's soul breaks through the human face. But Kubrick believed the truth lived in take number 70, take number 80, take number 100, long after the actor's spirit had been drained dry. How could a man tell the difference between the first take and the 70th? Duvall once asked a friend. He didn't say it angrily. He said it with disappointment. Because he had admired Kubrick once, admired the films, admired the imagination. But now, when he looked at them, he saw something else. Performances beaten into submission, not born from freedom. So when Hollywood called Kubrick a visionary, Duvall refused to nod along. He didn't join the chorus of praise. He didn't pretend the man was a saint. He simply said, in a calm voice that cut deeper than rage, he was a genius, but a genius without a heart. And that was the moment the industry turned on him. But Duvall didn't care. He had already made up his mind. In his world, there was nothing more sacred than an actor's soul. And Stanley Kubrick, no matter how brilliant, had forgotten that completely. 5. Robert De Niro had always been a quiet storm in Hollywood, a man who carried entire characters inside him like ghosts. And from the outside, people assumed he and Robert Duvall shared the same artistic bloodline, two craftsmen shaped by discipline, patience, and decades of work. But underneath the polite smiles at award shows and the carefully worded interviews, there was a long, simmering Cold War between them, a rivalry built not on anger, but on philosophy. Two actors who believed in truth, but reached it in opposite ways. Duvall never raised his voice at De Niro. He never confronted him or allowed the press to turn it into spectacle. Instead, it lived silently between them, an unspoken critique, a clash of belief systems. He once summed it up with a sentence that sounded like praise until you paid attention to every syllable. He's good at playing Italians. Very good. But it wasn't a compliment. Not really. It was Duvall saying the costumes, the accents, the transformations, everything the world applauded, were just masks. Masks he believed hid an empty core. It went back decades, to the years after The Godfather Part 2, when both men became symbols of serious acting. Hollywood worshipped De Niro for his transformations, shaving his hair for Taxi Driver and gaining over 60 pounds for Raging Bull. Directors praised his commitment. Journalists named him the greatest actor alive. But Duvall looked at all of that and saw something different. He saw a performance built on physical change rather than emotional truth. He saw a kind of obsession that threatened to swallow the actor whole. He once told a friend quietly, The work isn't in the weight gain, it's in the silence. That line was meant for De Niro, and everyone who heard it knew. Hollywood celebrated De Niro's shape-shifting genius, but Duvall felt it was vanity disguised as craft, discipline dressed up as depth. When De Niro shifted into comedies in the 1990s and 2000s, playing neurotic gangsters and analyzed as or a paranoid father in Meet the Parents, Duvall muttered to a colleague, "There's the mask cracking." He wasn't mocking the films. He was pointing out the fragility of the method itself. De Niro heard the whispers but refused to fight back. His only public response was a careful, almost gentle line. "Bob's a serious actor. We just have different energies." That was the polite truth. The private truth was that they avoided each other for decades. Two men who shared the same industry, the same respect, but never the same space. And maybe that was a quiet tragedy of it. Two legends who could never see eye to eye, simply because the thing that made one great was the thing the other could never respect. 6. Bruce Beresford was never supposed to become Robert Duvall's enemy. In fact, he was a man who directed Duvall to his first and only Oscar, a moment that should have bound them together forever. But instead, it tore them apart. What happened on Tender Mercies left a wound so deep that Duvall never spoke the director's name again without bitterness. The tension began quietly, almost invisibly, the way most creative fractures do. They were filming in Texas, the dusty road still cold from dawn, the air thick with that lonely ache the film depended on. Duvall had built his character from silence, small movements, a man carrying bruises so old they didn't hurt anymore. But Beresford didn't see it that way. Again and again, he demanded more takes. 10, 20, 30, insisting the rhythm wasn't right. The pauses were too long, the stillness too heavy. It was during a scene where Duvall's character spoke softly about regret that the dam finally cracked. Beresford cut him off, walked toward him, and said, "You're dragging it. Pick up the pace." Duvall stared at him, anger rising like heat from a desert road. A drunk man never speaks slowly. He snapped back, each word sharp enough to cut air. But Beresford refused to yield. And that was the moment Duvall decided he was done letting someone else define his character. At dawn one quiet morning, without telling the director, he arranged for a small crew to film the church performance, a scene drenched in raw emotion, faith, and brokenness. It was illegal, impulsive, reckless, and utterly true. That stolen take became the emotional centerpiece of the entire movie. It was a version the studio used. It was a version critics praised. It was a version that won him the Oscar. When Duvall walked onto that Academy Award stage, clutching the golden statue that validated a lifetime of work, he did something no one expected. He thanked the screenwriter. He thanked the crew. He thanked the cast. He even thanked the extras. But he did not thank the director. The room froze. The silence was heavy enough to swallow the applause. The next morning, headlines screamed what Hollywood already understood. Duvall had made his message brutally clear. Beresford's name would never sit next to his success. Beresford responded in interviews with a cold restraint, saying, "I respect him, but we can never work together again." But Duvall didn't hide his truth. Asked why he'd left the director out, he simply said, "Sometimes you have to choose loyalty, either to a person or to the character. I chose the character." They never reconciled, never shared another set, never spoke in public again.